I read Edgedancer by Brandon Sanderson. This is a short story that ended up being kind of the main feature of the Arcanum Unbound,
That's wrong.
which was a collection of all the short stories that I've already covered for the Summer of Cosmere, where I'm reading all of the stories in the Cosmere in their published order. So this will contain spoilers for Elantris, the Stormlight Archive, Era 1 Mistborn, and about half of Era 2 Mistborn so far. Edgedancer is the story of Lift, which began in the second Stormlight Archive book, Words of Radiance, as one of the interstitial stories between the major parts. I didn't talk about Lift at all, even though she is one of my favorite characters in the Stormlight Archive. And it's cool to see her get her own featured story of a novella length. Edgedancer takes place between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer, the next Stormlight Archive book. And so it takes place right after the advent of the Everstorm, which is crossing Roshar and kind of triggering the Parshmen in the world to become self-aware. In Lift's interstitial story from Words of Radiance, she is hunted by the Herald Nail, who is killing Radiance. So we've seen him do this in other interstitial stories between the first two novels of the Stormlight Archive, where he's like finding people who have radiant powers and killing them. We find out in this story why he was doing that, basically to prevent the next desolation from manifesting, kind of the opposite of what Gavilar's whole crew was trying to do, where they're trying to make the desolation happen so that the heralds will return and kind of usher in a golden age, or at least give a deep purpose and to humanity and a reason for all of the peoples of the world to unite together. Nail is trying to prolong the peace that is happening through killing Radiance, I guess, to prevent more desolations somehow. I'm not totally sure how that's supposed to work, but I don't think it's supposed to make sense because we see that Nail's psyche is quite fractured and damaged by the end of the story. But in Liv's interstitial story, she is instrumental in helping to replace the leader of Azir after Szeth assassinates him. In Azir, they have a way of picking who their leader is based on applications for the job that include an essay portion, and basically all of the candidates are writing terrible applications and essays in order to avoid the duty, because they're sure that they're going to be the next person who gets assassinated if they get the job. And when Lift breaks into the palace with a group of street urchins and thieves, they end up encountering Nail, and he kills her friend Gawx, who is just a street urchin thief. And then by the end of the story, because of Lift's powers, she's able to heal him from the edge of death and bring him back to life, basically. And for the viziers of Azir, they're like, oh, this would make him the perfect candidate to be our leader, because if the assassin in white kills him, then he'll be able to come back to life. And so they take it as kind of a sign from the heralds, which is ironic, right? And put Gawx in charge of their country, kind of as a puppet ruler where the viziers are the actual power behind the throne. But it's a happy ending anyway to her story. And we learn that Nail is limited or like contained by the letter of the law in whatever region he is operating in. He cares a lot about following legalistic rules, but it doesn't seem like he cares very much about the spirit of those rules. We'll talk more about the kind of philosophical disposition of Nail as I get into the story, but all of that to say that Lift becomes an important person in Aesir as they realize that she must have radiant powers, and she's best friends with the leader of the country. And because Lift is a street urchin and thief and an orphan, she doesn't feel comfortable being in the palace. I think this gets back to the kind of themes that I was talking about in Words of Radiance, especially with like Kaladin and Shallan, where they start to experience some kind of success or security, and they don't know how to cope with it because they've never encountered those kind of conditions in their life before. And so they have a bad reaction to it and kind of take that 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of motion. So Lift has entered into a very secure place in her life where she could receive training, like an education. She could research more about her abilities. She could use the resources of the country to find out things about her life that are confusing to her. And most of all, she could be well fed, which is something that Lift cares a lot about. But she gives all that up because she is more used to being in an insecure, kind of hungry position in life than she is with all of that security and community around her. She feels like she's going to be exploited or taken advantage of at any moment when she's in the castle. And so she feels very, very anxious in that safe space. She doesn't know how to deal with safety. This gets back to the way that the Radiants are fundamentally kind of traumatized or psychologically damaged as characters. It's a requirement for the way that the investiture works in the story. We talked about how the trauma kind of spiritually fractures the characters, and that allows the investiture to start to come into their actual soul itself in some way. For Lift, her radiant spren is named Wendell, and he is a very kind of cowardly character. He's a very fussy, masculine character, which again gets back to that whole thing about the Jungian anima that I talked about in the previous Stormlight podcast as well. There's a balancing that happens on Roshar in terms of Lift being female, Wendell being male, Lift being adventurous, reckless, and Wendell being careful and moderate. And Wendell is constantly advising her to like stay in Aesir, stay in the secure place, practice your powers, work on your radiant progression, but do it in a way that doesn't put us in mortal danger or, risk anything that has to do with like breaking the bond, and which would kind of break Wendell's mind. Lift covers up this entire bond that she has with Wendell psychologically by calling him a void bringer and claiming that he is an evil spirit that she is kind of trapped in some way and has enslaved to her will, and allows her to have magical powers. Like, she understands that the bond is giving her something, but she won't acknowledge how she has become kind of special by attracting a spren. Like, she depicts it to herself and to Wendell especially as the exact opposite of what's really going on, which is like very fun and stresses Wendell out and exasperates him. I love the dynamic between the two characters. It's very, very funny. But the other thing about Lift that's super weird and different versus all of the other Radiant characters that we've met is that Lift cannot use Stormlight, and her powers don't come from Stormlight in terms of like, being powered up, being the kind of power source that gets diminished over time, the way that we've seen with Kaladin and Shallan and all of the other Radiant characters. Instead, somehow Lift's powers come from eating food. And so she's metabolizing the food directly into magical energy that Wendell can use. And we get hints in the story that Lift went and saw the Night Watcher, and through the old magic was somehow transformed in a special way that gives her abilities that other Radiants have never had. And Wendell himself seems to be quite different from Syl and Pattern in terms of like the amount of lore and memories from Shadesmar that he has access to. He remembers a lot more of his past than the other Spren seem to. And he knows a lot more about what is going to happen during, or what should happen during Lift's progression than the other Spren do. And he kind of like is really bad at keeping the secrets as well. This seems to be, at least to me, an effect of the Night Mother changing Lift in some way. She's also able to, it seems like, kind of reach into Shadesmar in some way. And so she can do things that shouldn't be possible. Wendell presents himself to her as a plant or a vine that is constantly growing all over the place. And like his face is a series of static images that, you know, are grown out of the vine and then turn into crystal and kind of shatter moments later. But all of that is invisible to everyone around her. Only Lift can see it herself. Kind of the way that the way that Syl and Kaladin operate with each other. Nobody else can see Syl unless she allows them to, as opposed to the way that Pattern works, where he's always visible to everybody and has to operate in physical space somehow. Wendell is able to do kind of impossible things and just like climb whatever, wherever. But the weird thing about Lift is that she can touch Wendell's body in Shadesmar in ways that Kaladin cannot touch Syl. And this allows her to kind of climb Wendell's vines and stuff like that. Now, Lift's powers are different than Shallan or Yasna or Kaladin, any of the other Radiants, because she's of a different order. She's an Edgedancer, which is where the story gets its name, of course. And her powers have to do with healing, like I said, how she can heal Gawks from the edge of death. But the main thing has to do with adhesion or like friction. So she can make herself sticky or slippery in turn, you know, based on an internal kind of calibration, the same way that Kaladin can internally calibrate how gravity affects him or the people around him, right? So without saying any words or using any stormlight or whatever, she's not like spraying stormlight all over the place to make things slippery, in other words. She just kind of affects her own body and can make parts of her body sticky or slippery. She calls this being awesome, which is so great. I love the way that she sees using the powers. She has her own vocabulary for all of this stuff. She's not interested in like the deep lore of being a Radiant or like using the right terminology. And that is part of the way that Lift is, to me, a totally different character who not only sits outside the norms in all of these ways that I've been talking about, you know, in terms of the Night Watcher, but I think she's kind of like accessing something else on an almost metatextual level, that she is a working class style character. And the way that she interacts and operates with authority on every level underlines that way that Lift is of a different class than the characters that we've encountered before. So just in that way that I just mentioned, that she calls using the powers awesomeness, and she calls her Spren a Voidbringer, and she thinks of the bond as like a totally different kind of thing than everyone else, just is one of the many ways that she is constantly undermining authority. She doesn't even call Nail by his name. She's named him in her own mind Darkness. And she has respect and fear for him in terms of like his power and ability, But what we find out is, she leaves the Aesir Palace because she's not comfortable with the security. Like I said, she's kind of like taking a step back into a more familiar trauma, which is not the psychologically strong or wise choice for her. But when she leaves the palace, she doesn't just like run away to go back to her thieving ways in some other city at random. She deliberately chooses to go to Tashikk, a city that we've heard about in Words of Radiance that's become kind of a hub for information via the span reads across the world. And the reason she went there is because she saw reports, or had overheard, because she can't read, reports about darkness being in Tashikk. And so what she's actually doing is hunting him down, because she knows that, he tried to kill her, and that if he's in Tashikk, the reason he's there is probably to kill another potential Radiant before they even know what's happening. And so she feels a compulsion to, confront Nail and try to stop this murder from happening. The setting of Tashikk is pretty cool. It's a city that, instead of being built to resist the high storms with like a kind of one-sided city shield, the way that a lot of other communities are built, it's actually built in deep trenches and crevices in the earth that have special irrigation systems to stop them from flooding during the high storm, but instead like use the water in really creative ways and allow the buildings of the city to be unique and different. And so like Roshar continues to be a fascinating setting that is full of various different, well thought out, like deep places. Roshar feels like a real living world to me every time we come back to it. And that plays into that epic fantasy kind of setting and tone that I talked about in the first Stormlight Archive book. That Sanderson is really doing something every time we go to Roshar of delivering us a kind of different level of fantasy storytelling than we get in the other novels of the Cosmere. I think because he's wanting to access that epic tone in order to not just like live in that space. I think that he genuinely wants to write epic fantasy in that way, but also he's playing with it and doing things, deconstructing it in different ways that are super interesting. And I think that this story contributes to that because of the way that Lift is the working class hero, like I said. Because the epic fantasy tone appeals to a more upper class level of characters. Like, think about the Lord of the Rings, right? We have the Prince of the Elves. We have, Aragorn, who is this human king in waiting, like the heir to the throne from a long lineage of heirs to the throne. Gimli, who's part of the royal court of the dwarves, and on and on. You have the humble hobbits, but even, Frodo comes from a really aristocratic background within the Shire, if you will. And so epic fantasy tends to deal with like princesses and kings and knights who all live in a kind of rarefied air of the society. And that's what we've been getting from the Stormlight Archive. Even though Kaladin is a dark-eyed character who is kind of lowborn within dark-eyed society, he actually experiences quite a bit of privilege. And even his name is often remarked on as being a kind of light-eyed name. And people mock him often for his bearing and the way that he talks and thinks, right? Like the way that Gaz calls Kaladin lordling all the time, right? And so my point being that even though Kaladin is a character who is deliberately part of the lower class, I think in the same way that the hobbits, don't exist in the same register of rarefied air of like Gandalf, Aragorn, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, he is a highly educated and somewhat privileged version of the dark-eyed people. And that's a deliberate choice because it gives Kaladin a lot of capability and capacity in order to become, they're the dark-eyed champion of the people, if you will. Like, he kind of needs to have all of that capability in order to stand in for them in the presence of Dalinar and Elokar and all of the, kings and princes and princesses of his society. Lift is a totally different kind of character who undermines that epic fantasy tone in a lot of ways. And she does this, like, we're always deeply in the third person perspective of all of the characters in the way that Sanderson writes his books. And so we're getting distinctive linguistic choices because we're inside the mind of Lift, if you will, even though we're not in a first person perspective where Lift is thinking like, I did this and I did that. We're still getting unspoken ways of characterizing the world around her that have to be like phrases like, it was starve and difficult to do this and that, because Lift is always thinking about food. Her language choices, do things like when she says starvin', it drops the G at the end of the word because she comes from that low class streets background and she's an orphan. So she didn't have the parents there to correct her diction the way that Kaladin's mother corrects his language. So a fundamental part of the character, not only from like the knowledge of her background, but even in the way that the word choices are happening in the sentences, underlines how Lift is a different economic class than the rest of the main characters that we've encountered in the Stormlight archive. And I think it's a deliberate choice to examine the kind of epic fantasy space. Like, what happens when you center a character who is not at the pinnacle of society? What difference can a character like that really make in an epic fantasy story? And this is further contrasted by the fact that her antagonist in the story is Nail, a herald of the Almighty. Like, there are parts of Roshar that worship Nail as a literal god, and he's an immortal enemy who is incredibly powerful and knowledgeable and has abilities that far outclass Lift's, not to mention, his access and privilege in society on top of that. So he's not just a formidable antagonist for her, he is everything that she is not. Like, usually in a story, I think that Nail would be the kind of protagonist character that we would follow in a typical epic of fantasy adventure. But instead, he is cast as the enemy. And even the way that Lift interacts with her magical powers, like the way that she gets her magical powers, forces us to kind of re-examine the entire way that value is created on Roshar, I think. And this is another choice that I find very deliberate and conspicuous in the story, like especially the way that it's emphasized in Edgedancer itself. So Lift doesn't care about the gemstones that hold Stormlight. And for the rest of the characters, there's a really big fixation. Like, think back to the Way of Kings and Kaladin trying to get the resources to create the beginnings of a society for Bridge 4. Like, he needs to buy the cooking pot and the supplies for that. He needs to buy bandages and, supplies to help heal his bridgemen. Money is a really big part of that. The bribes that he has to pay to Gaz, right? The same thing for Shallan. She cares a lot about money. Her house is falling apart in the Way of Kings, and that's part of the whole motivation of why she needs to find Yasna in the first place. You would think that a homeless orphan like Lift, who is also a thief, would care about money a lot, but she doesn't care about money at all. She only cares about, like what in literary theory we would call like use value from the Marxist tradition. And so like the way that Marx explains it, there's a difference between how much something costs and, in terms of its value, and how much value that has to you in particular in terms of its use. And so the ruling class, people like Dalinar and Shallan and Elokar and Sadeas too, think back to the Way of Kings, they look at a shard blade, like think of how Sadeas values the shard blade, right? As a symbol of status and power, access. It's not a tool that's used in warfare for Sadeas, maybe the way that it is for Dalinar. Instead, it has an entire like symbolic valuation that comes with it. And that is the primary attraction of the shard blade for Sadeas. He's not seeing it in terms of its use value. In other words, he's seeing it in terms of the value that the culture places on it, the kind of fetish that is made out of the shard blade. And that is where its value lies. It's the same thing for money, right? Money is a completely symbolic medium for valuation in any economy, not just the fictional economy of Roshar. But the spheres that people use, that contain the different gemstones which symbolize denominations of money, operate symbolically the same way that, paper money in our societies work, right? Where just because the piece of paper has a larger symbolic number on it means that that piece of paper is worth more. But there's no intrinsic value because the way that you use money has nothing to do with actual valuation, right? Like if you go to the grocery store and you buy groceries for your family, that food has a use value to you that has nothing to do with how much the food cost. You need that food in order to survive. And so there's a kind of infinite use value, if you will, on the actual food itself for you in terms of your survival for the next, time in between when you bought groceries and you're going to buy groceries next time. And it has nothing to do with the actual amount of money that you spent on it. You're just trying to get the best deal in terms of that symbolic money because the use of the food is the point of having it. So all of that theory to say that this is the emphasis and disposition of Lift as a character. She doesn't care about the symbolic order of money, the symbolic order of Stormlight, which becomes more important in Words of Radiance, right? They start to really worry about having access to Stormlight because now they have these Radiants and they need to use the Oath Gates. They're starting to have to ration and requisition Stormlight. And so Stormlight itself becomes an entire new medium of valuation. But Lift doesn't interact with that whole system. She can't use Stormlight. She doesn't breathe it in and use it the same way that the rest of the characters do. So she doesn't care about spheres. She doesn't care about the valuation of money. She doesn't care about Stormlight. Instead, she cares about food. She is firmly tied, like in the way that the character is calibrated and built by Brandon Sanderson, to care about the use value of things. That is where she gets her magical power from, is the use value of the food itself. Part of the reason for her to go to Tashik, which like comedically undermines this entire epic fantasy tone, is to eat their special festival pancakes that they have going on at this time of year, where they're celebrating the heralds and each one of them gets like a different kind of pancake. And so what she tells Wendell is like, we're going to Tashik to eat these pancakes. It's going to be awesome, right? And so usually we need to eat food, right, in order to survive. And certainly Lift needs food in order to survive. But she's also getting the magical power from it because of the special augmentation from the Night Watcher. And so just like how the money had a certain value to Kaladin, and then later the Stormlight kind of took the place of that value for him, like the Stormlight became more valuable than the money itself, food is taking up this double position symbolically and like literally in a materialist way for Lift. She doesn't want to eat the pancakes merely to experience the delicious flavor of the pancakes. She wants to eat the pancakes in order to get access to her awesomeness. Additionally, she also talks about like being a thief. Her goals as a thief are not to steal extremely valuable things, kind of resell them on the black market, and keep the money and kind of accumulate wealth, kind of bypassing the usual system of work and money acquisition in the economy the way that like real thieves do, right? Like that's the whole point of being a thief, is that it's easier, quote unquote, to steal the money than it is to earn it. She's not interested in that. What she wants to do is to steal people's lunch. She wants to steal food from authority figures, and this kind of undermines their position of authority and points out the way in which they are just the same thing that Lift is, and that there's just kind of a pretense in society that says, oh, this person is an important member of the military or a king or what have you, that everybody is just a person who needs to eat. And Lift is kind of illustrating that by her behavior of stealing their lunch. That's a thing that she literally says over and over in her interstitial story and in this story. And so again, I think that she's kind of like a low-class Marxist hero in the way that she is disrupting authority wherever she goes by not engaging in the money systems that the economy is concerned with, in undermining the value of Stormlight, and in illustrating the way that everybody actually needs to deal with use value in their lives and not with symbolic valuation, the way that everybody is fixated on. You know, like if she comes into a king's palace and steals their lunch, that's the same kind of depravity of use value that a homeless orphan on the street is experiencing at the same time. It points out the way in which these stratifications of society are artificial and imposed on us. And instead, we're all included in a wider community of outsiderness, if you will. The way that I've been talking about, you know, with Wayne and his radical empathy, the way that Bridge 4 operates as an inclusive environment for everybody in the society. And that's part of like what makes it good, quote unquote, in the Cosmere, because there's this radical inclusion of everyone. Lift manages to deliver the same kind of effect, but she does it through thievery. And it's another way that Sanderson kind of troubles that good and evil dichotomy that rests in the core of the Cosmere, if you will, that like what is good and evil, it definitely exists out there. We see the kind of hard limits of what the Spren will allow their Radiant to do and to not do. Wendell doesn't worry too much about the fact that Lift is stealing from people. He doesn't care about that. Where I think that Syl would really worry about Cal stealing from people. This would bother Syl a lot, but it's okay for Lift to do it because the rules of good and evil and virtue are different they're not universal rules. The point of goodness is not to be an obedient rule follower, in other words, but to adhere to the virtues of the radiant order that Lift is a part of. So the thing that is important for the Edgedancers is their recognition of the equality and validity of people who live in the lower class, the people who are forgotten or passed over by the ruling classes. And so her order itself, I think, is fixated on a kind of like proletariat, if you will, that she's more worried about the workers than she is worried about the owners, which is why Lift feels like a very Marxist character to me. She has this different relationship to money, this different relationship to class, and she is kind of supernaturally fixated on the working class people and the dispossessed, the subaltern, and all of that. And so what is like the first thing that she does when she gets to the city? She goes to Yeda, which I think I said Tashik, but I guess she hears about it through Tashik and then goes to Yeda. Yeda is the place with all the trenches. Like, you can tell I'm doing this off the top of my head. Even when I was talking about Tashik, I was like, is that totally right? I remember Tashik being different. So yeah, Yeda is the place that she goes to, and as soon as she gets there, there's, like a line to get into the city. Of course, she just cuts through the line. She doesn't care about that. And then there's like a guard shack where they're checking in everybody's stuff. And this guy is some kind of smuggler or bandit who is stolen grain and food from someone outside of Yeda. And he's going to bring it into the city in order to sell it at a, 100% profit. And the guard kind of knows that this dude is corrupt, but she's not going to arrest him. She's just going to kind of like harass him with paperwork and taxes and hold up his operation. And instead, Lift kind of delivers a more materialist kind of justice to him in stealing what he stole from somebody else and redistributing it to the people. And so she uses her powers of adhesion to make the grain just kind of slip out from his cart and slip along the street and then wash into the poorest part of the neighborhood. And then at the same time, she steals the food of the guard. And so, right there, she's like undermining all kinds of systems of authority. She's delivering material justice directly to the perpetrator, and she's giving back to the people. All of this is part of what makes her a Marxist hero to me, and is what is so interesting to put a character like that at the center of the epic fantasy story. This is just not the way that we usually deal with these kind of characters. You might have like a Robin Hood-like character, but you think about Robin Hood, he's one of the gentry. He is a knight. It's just that the symbolic order of his kingdom has been inverted to where there was a good king and now there's a bad king, and that makes good men into outlaws. Lift is just a straight up outlaw. She's a person who doesn't operate in authority successfully. She can only operate from the margins and outside of the system. And so once she gets into the city itself, the first place that she kind of latches onto, of course, is an orphanage, a place for the dispossessed, the people who can't defend themselves. This is where she is attracted to. And she encounters a character that is named the Stump, who runs the orphanage, who seems like a really cruel character who, while she feeds the orphans, seems to mistreat them or not take their plight very seriously. Like, we encounter a character who has mental deficiencies, and she's like telling that character, oh, you're faking it. You're not really sick. There's nothing wrong with you. Just cut that out. And she's not interested in helping Lift out very much or giving her very many meals. But the point of her going to the orphanage is that she's going to be able to gather information from the kids and from the other people who live in this lower class neighborhood about people who, are weird or have strange abilities, because she's trying to hunt down the target of darkness and get to them before darkness has a chance to murder them. And so she narrows it down that probably the stump is the person who has weird powers actually. And that's why she thinks that the children are faking it, because she is unconsciously healing the kids in the same way that Kaladin was unconsciously defending Bridge 4 on the bridge runs by attracting the arrows to himself and things like that. But right when she realizes who the person is and what's happening, how she's accidentally healing the orphans and everything, that is when darkness comes to kill her. And also the moment when the Everstorm hits the community for the first time. And because of the way that the trenches are built, to fight off the high storms, it makes them extremely vulnerable to the Everstorm, which moves in the opposite direction. So the trenches kind of work with the high storm winds in order to shield the city from the wind in that direction. But with the Everstorm, it turns the streets into wind tunnels that kind of speed up the winds and tear the buildings down with the extreme forces that are happening, in addition to also changing all of the Parshmen into dangerous warriors. Obviously, it's really symbolically significant that the Everstorm comes at the very moment that Nail is going to commit this murder. Lift has to make a choice of is she going to allow this to happen? Is she going to be able to gather up the courage to defend the stump? Is it even worth defending the stump? Because I think, emotionally, we're not made to care about the stump very much. But after having gone through Words of Radiance, I think we can see how, Kaladin stood up for the people that he hated. That was part of his Radiant journey. It feels like the right thing to do for Lift to intervene for a character that she doesn't even like very much. It's the more heroic choice, right? And that is what she does, but she doesn't do it for the same reasons that Kaladin does, because she ends up swearing the third ideal here, much like Kaladin did in the previous book as well. Her ideal says, "I will listen to those who have been ignored." And so, it's about defending people like the orphanage worker who is never acknowledged by the city, who is not appreciated even by the orphans. And, that's kind of down to her own bad personality. But it is true that she is a person who has been ignored. And so it feels right to step into that place. But where Kaladin confronted Zeth in order to defend Dalinar and, the rest of the people who are fighting the Parshendi in the previous book, this doesn't come down to a contest of who's a better fighter, because that is a contest that Lift would definitely lose. Instead, she kind of again undermines the very system of conflict that happens in epic fantasy so often. This doesn't come down to a magical battle or a fancy sword fight or something like that. Instead, Lift sees that the Everstorm is triggering something in Nail, that it's forcing darkness to confront the way that he has failed. He was given this mission by one of the other heralds to assassinate anybody with radiant powers in order to prevent the desolations from coming back. But now the desolation has come back. His efforts have been worthless. And the Everstorm is the direct, irrefutable evidence of that in this moment where he is trying to murder yet another radiant. And what Lift sees there in that moment of his brokenness, of his confronting his failure, is that even though Nail is this incredibly important person, this person who is literally worshipped, who has been alive for thousands of years and is incredibly powerful and knowledgeable and the head of his radiant order, he fundamentally, in his core, his true emotional self, is a person who has also been ignored. In a way, he has been ignored by himself. All of this effort that Nail has put into to follow the rules exactly is actually an emotional coping mechanism for not having to deal with his emotional self, who feels empathy for his victims, for the lawbreakers, and wants to offer them mercy, wants to try and counsel them out of their criminal behavior instead of punishing them, instead of killing them. But he finds this compassion confusing, and that it directly conflicts with what he feels like is his radiant duty, his compulsion to adhere to honor. That for him, honor is following the law, even though your emotions tell you to do something else. And so he's completely suppressed his emotional and feeling self in order to follow these rules. And so in that way, Nail has ignored himself in a very fundamental way. The person that is being worshipped, the person who is, the character of the herald of justice, is a persona that has nothing to do with the actual person inside of Nail himself. And we see that he's carrying this tremendous burden of responsibility for protecting the entire world from disaster by murdering hundreds of people over thousands of years who are manifesting powers because of their personal interaction with honor, and that he has to suppress the feeling that, to become a Knight Radiant must intrinsically be some kind of honorable and good thing. Nail has to deny that is real because one of the other heralds told him that this is the good and right thing to do. So he is suppressing his conscience. So I keep talking about that from, Ellen Venture and Mistborn, that he follows his conscience and comes to a place of balance with the way that he interacts with the letter of the law and of forming the laws of society and following the religion of the survivor. He doesn't follow all of those rules because of the rules themselves. He is following his conscience and recognizes that the law is a powerful tool for crafting a society that delivers justice and prosperity to its people. Nail's not interested in that project. He can't be. The law operates as, like I said, a coping mechanism for him to not have to interact with his emotional self. Lift reaches past all of that coping mechanism and directly kind of touches, if you will, the emotional reality of Nail. She embraces darkness and allows him to weep and to feel his failure and to confront what he has done and have to make the choice to acknowledge the fact that the desolation is here, that the emergency has happened, and that what he has been doing has not been effective or useful. And so where it feels like in the story we're going to have this big epic confrontation between these two magical people with, special indestructible weapons, and that Lift is going to stand up for the proletariat against the ownership class in this kind of Marxist way that I'm saying, what she actually does is completely destroy that symbolic order of owner versus worker, and instead radically include the owner into the community of the public at large. So just like how Wayne in Mistborn Era 2 doesn't care if you are a noble or a terrorist person living on the street or a roughs criminal, like everybody is just people to Wayne. Lift has, because she doesn't care about authority or status, that she approaches all people as people, has managed to sweep away all of those things that are separating Nail from the communities that he is ostensibly a really important part of. You know, the fact that people worship him and he's the head of his Radiant Order would all seem to say that he's like firmly embedded in community. But the truth is, all of those things are actually preventing darkness from being in the community. And it's only by recognizing that emotional self, that self who is in contact with his conscience, that is the part of Nail that is actually a member of the human community. And by bringing him back into contact with that, Lift kind of quote unquote defeats him, because what she's actually defeating is this duty and this obligation that he has to the Radiant Order. This causes him to flee the city and run away and seek counsel to find like what is it that he needs to actually be doing since the desolation has come back. And so in the exact same way that at the beginning of the story, Lift, you know, kind of has taken those 2 steps forward and joined a stable community in Aesir and had, you know, stable access to food and friendship and community and all of that stuff. And she leaves all of that and takes 1 step back to get back into the familiar territory of being a homeless orphan. The exact same thing happens with darkness, right? He, for a moment, encounters community and all of the things that he has in common with the rest of humanity, and he immediately retreats from that and runs away because it is too painful and scary and difficult for him to actually cope with his reality. He needs to escape back into that symbolic order of being a very, very important person in the rarefied air of society and going back to the mission of saving the world so that he doesn't have to encounter himself. And so again, where does heroism lie? Where does villainy lie in the Cosmere story? There's this alignment of integrity in Lift that she is more and more encountering the truth of who she is. By the end of the story, she doesn't really think of Wendell as a Voidbringer anymore. She calls him a Voidbringer, but only because it annoys him. She doesn't actually believe that story anymore. She's coming to acknowledge the fact that she is a Radiant Knight. And so Lift becomes more closely aligned with that difference between the signifier and the signified that I keep talking about all the way back in Elantris. Nail, for a moment, becomes fully aligned, that signifier and signified, the thing that he seems to be and the thing that he really is, actually like come into contact with each other for a moment, in that moment where Lift embraces him and he weeps, and then he immediately misaligns things again and retreats and runs away. And therein his villainy lies, I think, that the misalignment of who he is with who he appears to be, who he tells himself he is, who he tells the world he is, versus what is actually at the deepest core of him, and that gap between them is what causes his villainy in the story. It's what the story is condemning as evil. So even though Lift is not, a perfect character by the end of the story, she is a little bit more honestly aligned with who she is. She has a greater level of integrity, And she goes back to Aesir and embraces the community and the belonging and the security, access to food that she has in Aesir, the friendship with Gox. Instead of, staying out in the world, she takes responsibility for the Everstorm and for this new crisis, and she wants to participate in making things better by not joining the symbolic order of owners, but of doing her part and allowing herself to become part of a community where she has the ability to care for the outsiders without herself being totally insecure in terms of resources and forgotten, where she is allowed to have relationships and friendships and those people that she can lean on emotionally, where she was afraid to do that at the beginning of the story. And so she does make some progress, and that is, affirmed in the story in a material kind of way where she swears that ideal and kind of gets like a level up in power. So it's like, dramatized in the story in terms of her magical ability, but symbolically, she obviously goes on this arc from being afraid of the security that she was in, community that she had in Aesir, to where at the end of the story, she accepts it and is happy about it. And so if we were going through the published order like I have been this whole time through the Summer of Cosmere project, the next thing that I would be going to is Arcanum Unbound that I mentioned earlier, which is a collection of all of the short stories that Brandon Sanderson had written up to this point, including Edgedancer. Edgedancer technically came out on its own right before Arcanum Unbound. And so like if you owned all the other short stories, you didn't have to buy Arcanum Unbound to get access to it. You could just get Edgedancer. But the thing about Arcanum Unbound, and I'm going to talk about it here, I'm not going to have its own separate episode because I've already talked about all of those stories, so you can go listen to those individual episodes. But it is kind of framed with these diegetic essays and thoughts of Chris, the scholar that we met in White Sand Volume 1. And like I mentioned in one of the other podcasts, at the end of the books, we get these Ars Arcanum kind of like glossary style or appendices style world building information, which are also diegetic documents written by Chris. And so at some point in the history of the Cosmere, and it's not totally clear to me when or how this is, Chris leaves the world that she's on in White Sand, goes out into the Cosmere and starts studying the magical systems of all of these places, but also the physical, like material world, planetary systems of these different worlds. And so a lot of the world building information and kind of lore of the Cosmere at large comes from Arcanum Unbound, where before, for example, the short story Sixth of Dusk, we get a short little essay from Chris talking about the actual planetary system, what she knows about the shard that is associated, the adamantium shard that is associated with the planet that Sixth of Dusk takes place on, and like the magical disposition of the place. And she does that for each of the different planets that we get stories from along the way. So there's a ton of information in there that's really interesting from a lore perspective, a world building perspective, and I love that stuff. So I'm a real sucker for all of those essays, but there's not anything there for me to talk about in terms of the kind of literary analysis and symbolic analysis that I'm doing in this project. So I'm not going to dedicate an entire episode of like poring over those essays. And then additionally, there's also like these afterwords for the stories where Brandon Sanderson gives a behind the scenes kind of information about each one of the stories, which itself is like interesting in a trivia kind of way. or might help somebody who's like an aspiring writer to think about how they're approaching their own world building and storytelling, but is not very useful, again, for the kind of analysis that I'm engaged with. So there won't be an episode on Arcanum Unbound. This is the most that I will ever talk about it. Instead, the next thing that I'll be moving on to is the next Stormlight Archive book, the very massive Oathbringer. Oathbringer is like the big turning point for me in the Cosmere, certainly in the Stormlight Archive, where we get this epic fantasy tone and it just totally undermines the entire genre and utterly shifts things in a fascinating way. So I'm excited to talk about that. I'm not excited for how long it will definitely have to be. It's going to really be a big episode, I think. But there's so much to talk about with the Stormlight Archive. So that will be the next episode.